Welcome to our continuing series of virtual voices focusing on sustainable development goals. We are very pleased today to have Dr. Bernard Goldstein, who is a WIT Board Member and who is also an Emeritus Dean and Emeritus Professor of Environmental and Occupational Health at the University of Pittsburgh School of Public Health. He is an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine, for whom he has chaired over a dozen committees. He has also served on or chaired committees related to environmental health for the World Health Organization, United Nations Environmental Program, and the Paris-based Scientific Committee on Problems of the Environment. His past experience includes appointments as assistant administrator for development of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and president of the Society for Risk Analysis. Over to you, Dr. Goldstein.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dorbach. It's hard to be upbeat at a time like this. It's a very sad time. I called Dr. Dorbach last week just to commiserate with her and learn from her, as I always do, and found out once again that I cannot say no to her when she said, "Oh, you called just in time. Our speaker next week is not able to speak. Would you please speak?" And I said yes, and of course I've never been able to say no to Dr. Dorbach. And so I've put together this approach that is really somewhat idiosyncratic and doesn't perhaps hang together as well as I would like. So I'm making excuses in advance. And let's go through that. And Susie, if you could put the first slide up. Great. So what I want to do is use the lens of sustainability to sketch the causes and the broader environmental issues. And briefly, and as I say, idiosyncratic, if you look at Putin's choice to invade the Ukraine and the lessons to be learned that are pertinent to preventing future wars caused by fossil fuel energy-rich autocratic societies such as Russia, and also others. I use Iran as another example. Obviously, war is the antithesis of sustainability. But on the other hand, the Ukraine has been given no choice but to fight. And conclude that those who are concerned with sustainability must include avoiding war in our considerations, and we must learn from what's happened here that maybe perhaps we did not do so as well as we could. Not just perhaps, I'm afraid. Next slide. So 2 definitions just to get us started. Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. Right now, I suggest to you that everybody in the Ukraine does not meet that definition. That being subject to war is not merely the absence of disease or infirmity, but the whole social, mental, and well-being of individuals cannot thrive under wartime conditions. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future. And obviously war does that. Next slide. When we talk about sustainability, there's 2 general types of formulations out there. One is a 3-legged stool in which the environmental and social and economic impacts are the legs of the stool. Another is a sort of a Venn diagram in which you have an overlap between environmental, social, and economic. And in that area of overlap is what we call sustainable development. The key points I want to make about this that trade-offs are needed to optimize among the social, environmental, and economic spheres. It's very nice to say that we're going to find the triple bottom line things to do. Those low-hanging fruits we've taken care of, in a sense, those things that improve both all our social, economic, and environmental well-being. It's not as simple as that. In the continuing challenges of human or natural factors being a volcano, something of that nature, but the human factors, war, global climate change, others. So we have to think of absolute sustainability as being really just part of it has never been achievable, but sustainability is a worthwhile goal and should be leading us in all our considerations. Resilience is another term we use a lot of, and in relation to sustainability, it can be defined as the ability to buffer sustainability from the unpredicted. I like the engineering definition of sustainability, which is based upon the old adage about the glasses to the optimist, the glass is half full; to the pessimist, the glass is half empty. In terms of sustainability, there's too much glass when you have a glass that's half full. We don't need that extra half of the glass, or we need to be able to right size everything. But in terms of the challenges we face, whether human or natural, we have to realize that the glass has to be bigger than just a half a size, because there are things that are going to make that water in the glass roll around a bit and spill over unless the glass is high enough. And the real challenge is, how high does it have to be? How resilient do we have to be to deal with these changes that are coming our way? And clearly war is completely antithetic to sustainability. Next slide. So there's two sets of slides, two questions I like to ask student groups as a way of introducing the concept of how complex our interrelated world is, and what the increasingly limited buffering capacity, and that's in a sense resilience, means. So why does overfishing off the coast of West Africa increase the likelihood of an emerging infectious disease reaching Pittsburgh? I say I've been asking this question for close to 20 years. And the second is, why does providing pipe water to local villages in much of the world help to combat global climate change? Well, there's overfishing by an EU fleet off the west coast of Africa. When it gets to be particularly bad, the price of fish in the marketplace of West African countries goes up. And that was shown in a series of studies published in very good journals. And what they also showed, next slide please, is that when the price went up, more bushmeat hunting occurred. And here's a picture of a man skinning an animal. Now this is of concern not only to the endangered species folks who wrote about the fact that species are being endangered because of overfishing, but it's also of concern to people who are worried about infectious disease. Where's the next infectious disease pandemic going to come from? And it comes from human interaction with animals. And here's a human being with a machete right next to his fingers that is also in the meat of the bloody meat of presumably a monkey. Well, monkeys are primates like we are. The blood transfer from a monkey to humans is something that one can worry about in terms of infectious disease. These two groups of people, the people worried about infectious disease, thinking it comes from monkey, the people worried about endangered species, worried about what's happening off the coast of Africa that's driving people to kill these species, they usually don't talk to each other. How can we get people to talk to each other to achieve sustainability? The experts need to do a better job of interacting. Next slide. Remember, my second question was, what does pipe water supply have to do with global climate change? Well, in much of the world, there is sort of a cultural prohibition of males carrying water. Only females carry water. And very often that includes walking quite a distance. And women begin water carrying duties once they reach puberty. And to do that, they must spend a fair amount of time, and they drop out of school. But just about every study of global climate change talks about the fact that about 50% of the driving force is population growth. If if you really want to cut down on population growth, you have to educate females. And this is something we're only slowly getting to understand. This is just something from the UN climate talks, the most recent ones in Glasgow, and the call for action to empower women and girls is something that's only slowly being adopted. We need to be more quick about that. We need to understand across these different boundaries how these things are linked. Next slide, please. Okay, so let me go to the gas issues. The Russian, and let me say, I'll probably do that again, say Soviet. Let me give just before I go to talk about Russia, let me give a little bit of my background, which is that in the 70s, there was a summit meeting between Richard Nixon and Chairman Brezhnev, and they couldn't agree on anything really important, so they agreed an exchange of environmental scientists, and I was one of the scientists, and I was fortunate to spend time in the Soviet Union, including in the Ukraine, including Kiev, at an institute there. And so some of my background is in that. Other my background, which will come up later, is that just a few years ago, I was a visiting professor at the University of Cologne, Department of Political Science and European Affairs, looking at comparing the EU and US shale gas activities. So what was Putin thinking of in terms of why he could perhaps, not perhaps, I think just about definitely, use the Ukraine as a way of splitting up NATO? Here you've got a headline from the New York Times on February 24th, just as the actual military activity began. Some but not all former European leaders quit Russian boards, except the most prominent, Germany's ex-chancellor, Gerhard Schroeder. Germany, to me, is crucial to the Western response. And I was very worried about this, and in fact spent reading about what's going on in the past couple of weeks, early on, focusing almost totally on getting additional information as to what was happening in Germany. This is part of the problem that we have, and the next slide, please. We have a decision under Schroeder's government when he was chancellor. This is he was chancellor until I think 2005. A definite move toward dependence upon getting cheaper gas from Russia. The German economy is an export economy. It makes things, it requires energy, and it basically wanted to get the energy specifically from the pipeline from Russia, bypassing the Ukraine, bypassing its previous route. And there's no time to go into the history of that. But so why is he so close to this? Here we have someone who's the chancellor of Germany, losing eventually to Angela Merkel. When he leaves the chancellorship, goes to work for Putin. He holds positions not only in the Gazprom, which is the state-owned Russian energy company, but he owns it. He has position in their major oil industry, energy industry that's government-owned. That's Rosneft, let's say Rosneft. And he said such things as that Ukraine, not Russia, was saber-rattling early into this, and that he also linked, you see at the bottom there, he took the link in to criticize those who have boycotted the Olympics in Beijing over Beijing's human rights record, saying that China is Germany's most important sales market. Well, to an American, too much of European foreign policy has been based upon who they can sell things to. And this to me is just an example of that you base your foreign policy on money rather than on human rights or other related issues. And not that the US is not guilty of that. Next slide, please. Another issue has been NATO as a paper tiger. Germany has been notably deficient among other European NATO members in reaching what was an agreed upon 2% target of gross domestic product being put into military defense for all NATO countries. Here you see a list of selected countries, not all of NATO, as percent of GDP and how they were making the target. The US is up at 3.5% of GDP. If you look at there, you've got Britain and France, Britain at 2%, France close to it, but the other countries are basically countries that are close to, with the exception of Greece, which you worry about Turkey, but are essentially close to the Soviet border that are making this. And if you look at the difference between 2014 and 2018, you see that Latvia, Lithuania, and Romania have greatly increased their percentage of involvement. Well, if you look at Germany's military, my goodness, most German tanks and planes simply don't work. They haven't put the money even to maintain them. And this is, I'm talking about most, I'm talking about more than 50% of their planes and tanks are not basically able to act militarily simply because there's no money for them. Their amount of person power in the military is less than what was needed. There's a quote there about from the Army's Chief of Staff that said last week, and this is a recent quote, it's from February 27th, that the Army I am allowed to lead is more or less powerless. Well, Putin's obviously misthought, because what's happened from, and I think mainly spurred by the defense of Ukraine by Ukrainians, has been a very strong move in the opposite direction, coming from the same party that Gerhard Schroeder comes from. Next slide, please. Here's what their party, this is the Social Democratic Party, and just as background, Germany basically is two major parties. One's a more conservative party, the other's a more liberal party. The Social Democrats are the more liberal party. The Angela Merkel's party was the more conservative, but both of these are relatively centrist parties. What happened under Merkel was that they had a joint leadership approach with the Social Democrats, the SPD, so that no major decision was made without both concurring. The Defense Department of Germany tried to put more money in to modernize their defense. You'll notice the date here is 2017. It is sometime after President Trump has basically berated NATO for its failing to keep up to the 2% thing. And Germany was going to lease drones, and that was approved at first by the Social Democrats. They were going to lease it from Israel, until the Social Democrats found out that the drones that were being released were drones that could fight. And they basically said they're going to stop doing that and block the sale. Now, there's left-wing antipathy to Israel may also played a role. And I point out that the German defense minister at the time is now president of the European Commission. And she just recently made a rather moving speech about the importance of Europe supporting importance of the EU supporting Ukraine. Next slide, please. So, you can talk about Germany because Germany has such a large percentage of is the leader in terms of gross domestic product, and their shortfall in terms of reaching the 2% NATO agreement is about $60 billion a year. But it's not the only country. It's just to me an incredible number. It's a New York Times headline about Belgium may have new appeal for millennials. They try to join the army and sleep at home. No barracks, no boot camp, no forging of a unit through this shared experience boot camp. The government officials, according to the New York Times, say that the average age in the Belgian armed forces is 44. I've been told that the joke in Europe is that Belgium has as many generals as they have privates. You can't fight an army with an average age of 44. This needs to change, and unfortunately, it required that change. But what's happened now to change it? But I think that one can fairly assume that all of this is well known to the Russians. All of this is well considered in their decision to to attack the Ukraine. Next slide. Let me also present an American view, if you will, which sort of in some ways summarizes some of the people who are in the United States who are not all that enthusiastic about joining with Ukraine until the events actually occurred. If you look at the gross domestic product in trillions and the population millions of the United States, China, the European Union, Germany, and Russia, you come out, if you look at the Russian gross domestic product, it's 1.5 trillion for 144 million people. The European Union's 13.4 trillion for 447 million. That immediately leads, if you will, an American to say, well, no, wait a second, why am I spending all my tax money on defending Europe? Why aren't the Europeans defending Europe? Why are they getting away with, if you will, using the United States as their police person and not paying the cop any decent salary for doing it? There's no joint approach up to now. And I think that was part of the willingness of Mr. Putin to feel that he could split up NATO even further over this kind of issue. I put in China and the United States in part because part of the approach by Americans who are less than enamored with Europe until recently has been to say, well, look, we got to worry about China. Why should we be spending all this money to defend Europe if these rich Europeans aren't willing to defend themselves? Again, I think that will change. One hopes it will change. One hears of the changes. I mean, the current Chancellor of Germany has basically said that they will meet the 2% and will exceed it. But we've heard all sorts of things. Is Nord Stream really off the table now? I hope so. It certainly seems to be. But at first, that was what I was looking at mostly. Would the Germans make what to them is a sacrifice of taking Nord Stream, of stopping this plan of getting lots of gas to run their industry? I think it also represents over time that the EU has recognized that China is more of a threat than it might have thought of, and is not willing to basically say, well, okay, don't pay any attention to China, just pay attention to our needs, to the United States, because the EU is not going to be able to do much about China. So all of these factors are part of it. I put in that the EU and NATO are not identical. I've used European Union figures, and I just haven't had time in these few days to go and add up all the different numbers because, for instance, Britain is not part of the European Union anymore. Norway is not. They both have a fair amount of defense funding, but just to know about that. Next slide, please. Well, I mentioned I was in Germany at the University of Cologne at a time when Obama went to Brussels. And he mainly pushed on increasing defense expenditures. That's why he wanted to go to Brussels. That's what he was mostly talking about. Well, at about that time, Germany was considering its own shale gas resources and was convinced by, well, we put it this way. Originally, the Merkel government said, oh, yes, we're going to drill for shale gas. We're going to use these unconventional gas drilling methods that were developed by the United States, and we're going to go drill for these. And it's not that the Europeans don't know how to do this. The French, for instance, are using these drilling techniques. The Total in Algeria for unconventional gas. They could easily do it in France. France was going to drill for their own shale gas. In fact, basically, you can say that the European experience, each EU country said, oh, technique, we've got shale gas, we can get some. And each European country then received a tremendous amount of pushback from environmental groups and did not go after the shale. Now, Britain still has it open a bit, and maybe Poland will go back to it now with these current issues. Obama was uncharacteristically sort of snappish. He was not his usual urbane self. At a press conference after he spoke at the EU about the defense needs, was pushed on shale gas. Was saying, well, will you give us shale gas? Will you promise American shale gas so that we, to us? And his response was, and I couldn't find the quote, I have a slide with it somewhere, that the US had to make very difficult decisions concerning shale gas and went and drilled for it. And that much like defense, he worked defense into every place he could, the EU would need to make similar difficult decisions. Those decisions were not made in favor of shale gas, even though the debate included the fact that, well, is it really safe for us to depend upon natural gas just solely from Russia? Next slide. So I basically told you this. Let me go into the last bullet. The defenders of this unconventional gas drilling in the US accused the US of being responsible for Europe not doing it because we failed to adequately oversee our industry as the reason. So for instance, Public Health England is a country that still has shale gas on its potential radar. Public Health England made a statement saying, well, we will pay a close attention to potential health implications and water damage and other things due to shale gas, which didn't happen in the United States. And they're right. We've just gone ahead with it, but we've gone ahead with it without the potential, without the appropriate oversight. Next slide. There's another problem which we don't talk about and which, some of the facile, if you will, psychoanalysis of Mr. Putin, and I'd love to hear Dr. Dorbach talk about that. So, have to do with the bully, the KGB background or whatever. But nationalism is still a real problem. And to believe that humans have no biology that potentiates us to be in conflict with each other, that potentiates the association with families or clans or larger entities like nations. It basically means if you don't think that that's real, you're not going to be able to manage that. I pointed that out at a meeting with some of the senior faculty involved with our Western European programs at the University of Pittsburgh. And the chair of political science told me that I was absolutely wrong about that if you can train humans, if you can toilet train humans, then you can train them not to go to war. I hope he's right, but I doubt it. It's something we need to take into account, and that may be happening here as well. Next slide. I wanted also to put the US in perspective by looking at a Pew survey. The Pew Foundation does surveys where they ask lots of questions. This is question 36 of a survey that was done. This is, I think, the data from 2012, because I had nice slides, was a nice graph, so you can make a slide of it. Imagine you're being asked a must-decide answer. You must decide between one of two possibilities. That the most important thing is that nobody in society should be in need, or the most important is that individuals should have the freedom to pursue life goals. Answering yes to both is not appropriate for this particular question. You've got to pick the one that's most important. And as you'll see, the US sticks out like a sore thumb. We are far more into freedom to pursue life's goals than nobody's in need. And this, I think, is part of our problem, whether it comes to vaccination for COVID or some of the other issues that we've had. Next slide. And I use that as a segue to, I think you all know who this is. He's speaking at the Rose Garden in this picture, explaining why the US left the Paris Agreement. which clearly is an agreement about a very important issue related to sustainability, that of global climate change. Next slide. And I just thought I would link this together by first showing you this talking points, which sort of summarize what it's all about. That it's just going to cost us jobs, wages are going to be lower, vastly diminishing production. Next slide. But as part of that speech, I think what's pertinent to us today is that the same nations, the second paragraph, asking us to stay in the agreement are the countries that have collectively cost America trillions of dollars through tough trade practices, and in many cases, lacks contributions to our critical military alliance. Now, Trump represents a significant portion of the American public, and this is a portion of the American public which is basically upset about the fact that the Europeans, and of course that's what he means in terms of the same nations. He's talking about Europe. There's nobody else who's not making contributions to our critical military alliance that they've promised. And this kind of attack on Europe and unwillingness to pivot away from Europe, or I guess it'd be the other way around. But basically, I think you're following what I'm saying, that the European trade practices against the US are very tough. I mean, when I teach about food, for instance, and trade issues, I tell the students in the US that if they want to get a hamburger or a chicken for lunch, just know that neither that hamburger or chicken is considered, it can be exported to the EU, nor can anything with GMO, because it's considered unhealthy. That's nonsense. It's got about as much science behind it, in my view, as does, say, those who are opposed to global climate change. But these are real things that affect real people in the United States and have to do somewhat with, and again, things that are not unknown to Mr. Putin. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, I really had trouble writing this slide and saying Trump deserves credit for anything. But in fact, his overt public attacks on the failure of many EU countries to achieve this commitment spurs some funding. The Germans went from 1.2% of their gross domestic product, 5% of their gross domestic product. As I say, they not only meet, but to exceed the 2%. And there's another. The fear that he or another like him might return as US president means that Europe must need to defend itself without depending upon the US. And what's happening in Ukraine has made that very clear to Europeans, that they need to defend themselves without just depending upon the US, because who knows, we might still need to pivot to China and forget about the EU. And there are people who are saying the same thing. We have Congress people basically saying, no, I don't think we should be spending all that money and all that time defending Ukraine, because we need to worry about China, not Europe. Europeans should do it. Next slide. Okay, so let me get to some of the cultural issues, and how am I doing on time? Christine?
Oh, you are fine. We're absolutely fine. You have plenty of time.
Glad to hear. So we have, I haven't set up my Alaska thing with the clock facing me now. We have, I just picked this out as being something that summarizes the difference between the United States.
You have about 10 minutes.
Good. I will get done in 10 minutes, I hope. We just have a lot of more floor space in our places. Germany isn't on this list. I will talk a fair amount about Germany, but the US isn't much different from other large countries. So Australia is on it. Canada isn't, but Canada would be like the US and Australia, and Germany would be like these others. And that space represents sprawl, and sprawl is basically something that doesn't help you with sustainability or global climate change. You use lots more gasoline getting back and forth to places, and all those other problems having to do with sprawl in the United States. Next slide. In Germany, you've got superb wind and solar power approaches. I mean, you really have to credit Germany with investing an enormous amount in wind power and solar power. They're doing their best to try to avoid having to get fossil fuel from anywhere. But if you want to see that from your car, it's sort of hard because you're going so fast that you better not take your eye off the front of the front of what you're driving. Next slide. And going fast is a German cultural attribute. There's this wonderful NPR thing about a speed limit on Germany's autobahns. It's like talking gun control in the US. You really cannot get the Germans to consider a speed limit because it's part of their culture. I love that last. Quicker than a passing German car, the transportation minister, Andreas Schroeder, changed gears. A speed limit was against all common sense. Then he canceled the working group's next scheduled meeting. Okay. Dealing with sprawl in the US is, you get the same kind of response. What I'm trying to say is that there are cultural differences. And we have to respect other cultural differences, but they have to respect ours as well. And again, that hasn't been part of the European-US dialogue. We do respect your cultural approaches. I don't think it goes the other way. And again, it's part of the problem. Next slide, please. It's just the amount of what I really said. Next slide, please. Other problems. I mean, under sustainability, until very, very recently, Germany was insisting, and the EU was insisting, that the baseline years for global climate change considerations, in other words, we're going to go for a 25% drop by such and such year, a 25% decrease, the baseline was 1990. You know, if I'm worried about global climate change, my baseline should be how much carbon dioxide or methane, whatever I'm producing now, versus what my target ought to be, not what it was in 1990. Why 1990? Well, if you say 1776 to an American, you really get a mental image of something. You say 1989 to a German, it's also a mental image. It's the year that the wall fell and Germany was reunited. Well, Eastern Germany was in many ways the manufacturing leader of the Comintern, the communist countries, and had all the factories and all the industries and was spewing out pollutants, was using very inefficient ways, but cheaper ways of making the same product that in the West was controlled to a large extent by more expensive pollution control devices. It's a lot easier to get a 2% decrease from a high baseline than it is from the lower baseline. 25% decrease from a really efficient power plant is really expensive compared to 25% decrease from a power plant that's just spewing out lots of pollutants. It's a tremendous advantage. It was also for Britain. Maggie Thatcher's major opponent as a conservative prime minister was the industry that with the coal miners industry. She loved it when she could go to the newly found North Sea oil and basically put the coal mines out of business. So this had nothing to do with how much pollution that you're trying to get rid of. It has to do with what's my best thing to put forward to be able to compete with the rest of the world. It's money. Next slide. Nuclear power. Germany, in response to Fukushima, put an end to nuclear power. Now, nuclear power doesn't produce any global climate impact, and they replaced it they could have replaced it with coal or oil that was relatively less polluting than their own coal, which is lignite. They didn't. They used German lignite. And so they've had an increase in particulates. They haven't been able to meet their carbon dioxide goals as they hope because of that. They will eventually because of their superb work in wind and solar. We've had a marked diminution in the use of nuclear power as well. If you will, in the United States, which I'm most familiar with the argument about nuclear, in the 1990s, we debated what to do with our nuclear waste, and we're going to put it underground in the Southwest, the trade-off was such that basically we asked the question, the National Academy of Science was told by Congress to look at the question of what was going to happen 10,000 or 100,000 years from now in terms of whether this nuclear waste would make it through any natural barriers and get to the public. Well, if you do the kind of risk assessment in terms of the public, well, the nearest public to where the waste was going to be is a town of about 1,500 people. If you assume that town even gets to 10,000 people, the worst case scenario coming out of the National Academy of Science, the best case scenario was that there would be complete containment, but the worst case was that starting in 100 years, these potentially cancer-causing radioactive things would leak out and might affect that town. Well, if you're doing, and the risk that the level that the Academy was told to look at was 1 chance in 100,000. Well, if you got 10,000 people, not the 1,500, but you have 10,000 people there, and there's 1 chance in 100,000 that someone will get cancer. Well, it's going to take 10 lifetimes to get to 100,000 people. That's 70-year lifetime. That's 700 years. That's 1 additional cancer every 700 years. My gosh, the amount of deaths that's going to occur from global climate change because we continue to spew out these fossil fuels are just swamped that one person every 700 years that we're talking about with nuclear waste. We're not appropriately changing our decision process for the new challenges of nuclear, of global climate change. And basically, we're using 20th century analyses to impose consequences on our 22nd century planet, because that's when the first cancer will occur. We need to go back and do trade-offs on these kind of things in ways that we haven't done them before. Next slide, please. And finally, as a pointing fingers at people, I'll make this outrageous suggestion that it's the fault of the polar bears. This is a picture from a major NGO. It is an NGO that does great things, and it's part of their sales pitch, if you will, to get people to give them funds. When Trump was running for re-election, Michael Greenberg and I did a paper in which we pointed out that if you wanted to do something about sustainability in the United States, the most important thing was to make sure Trump did not get re-elected. That was job one. If you look at the people who are concerned about polar bears, you're looking at people who are not likely to vote for Donald Trump. To beat Donald Trump required to think through who are the people who are likely to vote for him. Well, the military voted for Donald Trump 60-40 in the previous election. Farmers voted for Donald Trump 60-40 in the previous election. The military are likely to be deployed where wars occurred, and there is no question that global climate change leads to threat intensification, puts people migrating, going to land which maybe their forefathers were at, that they weren't there before, and all of the conflicts that can occur anywhere in the world because of global climate change. They're just, I'm sorry, anywhere in the world for whatever reason can be accelerated by global climate change. The US Congress knows that and has voted money, even under Trump, has voted money for the Defense Department to continue to do the work they've been doing on the potential threat intensification due to global climate change. Farmers are obviously affected as well. Why aren't our NGOs who job one, let's get rid of Trump? Why aren't our NGOs focusing on people who are, maybe don't understand that they're more at risk? Why are they focusing instead on people who vote for Trump? It's because they're raising money. And people who will vote against Trump are people who are much more likely to fund them. We need to focus more on talking to people who have viewpoints that can be changed because they will then recognize that it's important to them. And I think, again, the suffering of the people of Ukraine makes that ability to bring that home more apparent. Next slide. So let me, we summarize what we need. We need analytical tools for sustainability that we don't have now. We do have life cycle analysis. We're starting to develop trade-off analysis. We need to be able to quantify the indirect economic costs and indirect the benefits to natural resources. We have to be able to measure resilience and social capital, et cetera. There's a whole series of other things. But the next to last bullet says incorporation of the impact of risk of war within analyses of alternative approaches to sustainability. And I would go back to shale gas, where all of us failed to incorporate the risk of someone like Putin think that, hey, I control natural gas and therefore I don't have to worry about anybody standing up to me. Next slide. So as long as fossil fuel energy is a major determinant of modern productivity and wealth, the world will be at risk from wars started by countries with large fossil fuel resources that are autocratic, such as Russia and Iran. Iran is more like the Soviet Union of the past in that there is almost a religious belief in, there is a religious belief in Iran, but the way communism was believed, there was a sort of a religious belief that this was going to improve humans and it was the right way to go forward. Our present Russia does not have that religious belief. It's got a nationalistic belief in its moving, in its approaches. We've got to be able to figure out how to limit the risk of war, even if it requires sacrifices related to the three legs of sustainability. We need to be able to pick and choose among the options. Ukraine, of course, had no choice. And in fighting for liberal democracy, it's, I think, in the long run and in the short run, fighting for sustainability. And my last slide, please. I can only wish you, the young people among us particularly, good luck in approaching these very difficult decisions that have to be made. There are always going to be winners. There's always going to be losers, and whatever the decision you make, you must make the decisions, though, keeping all of the potential facts and risks in mind. Thank you.
Bernie, thank you very, very much for a wonderful presentation, not only historical, educational, but also politically very realistic. I was listening today to the Columbia University discussion on this, and basically the representative from Germany said that they stopped the line, but then one of the other speakers said that the problem is that Russia is not going to worry about that because the Chinese are buying all of their gas and they are building pipes that way. I think that it is extremely important, the slide that you put about the monkeys, there's no question that there's a lot of aggression in the human being. Basically, that's what made us achieve what we have, but we have to mitigate it with education and knowledge. And your perspective and your point about the importance of women and to basically decrease the size of our population, which has been growing something like 1 billion every 10 years, is only approachable if we educate women and stop producing all the stuff that we have. Now, I'm going to forward this to Susie, who's going to be moderating the rest of the questions. Susie?
Thank you, Dr. Goldstein, for such a relevant presentation, especially as we work toward a more sustainable future while also battling disasters like the war in Ukraine. So the first question from the audience is, why does the Ukraine crisis matter to everyday Americans, and why should we all care?
Well, from a very selfish point of view, one can say that if President Putin is successful, we will see more and more of this throughout the world. The United States eventually will become directly involved. We can't just hide behind our oceans. We need to get involved earlier rather than later. I think President Biden has done a very good job of getting us involved. More may need to be done.
Would a more environmentally conscious planet lead to less war? And if so, how? What do you believe are the interconnections of this?
I think that environmental consciousness is a recognition of, I don't want to use the word desperate. I probably would use the word desperate if it wasn't what's happening in Ukraine. That's a desperate situation. But there's nothing, as I said, there's nothing more antithetical to sustainability than a war. I mean, it's you're killing other people. I guarantee you, a tank commander in a battle doesn't pay any attention to whether they're running over an endangered species area or a natural growth area, rather than sticking to the roads where they may be more of a target. You simply just lose all of your guidance that makes you environmentally sound when you're fighting for your life and for the life of your colleagues and your country. So we need to do anything we can to stop war, and that's just a sort of job one in an environmental issue, and it's one that we haven't thought of enough. Well, let me add something I thought of adding, but I've been very much taken by the fact that when Trump came in as president, he had a Congress that supported him, and they ripped out wherever they could any sort of global climate change initiatives in federal bureaucracies. And the Defense Department, the U.S. Defense Department, has had a global climate change program going for a couple of decades. I think it was started by Bill Clinton. And a right-wing congressman, Tea Party congressman, basically said, let's get rid of that and put an amendment into the budget for the Defense Department to basically get rid of that. The amendment lost. It lost not only because all the Democrats were opposed to it, but because over 40 Republicans, about 20% of the Republican Congress people, voted against this amendment because they supported global climate change being part of the military. We have to remember that the military is something that can have a positive role, if you will, in looking at the issue. But part of its positive role is being strong enough to deter the Putins of the world.
Thank you. How can nuclear energy be secured during times of war, like current problems with reactors and the war in Ukraine?
Well, I don't know that I can't imagine, for instance, that Russia would target a nuclear energy site, so it released things. I mean, the prevailing winds, actually the prevailing winds in Europe, I think, go from west to east. The winds would just blow back into Russia. So it's not a targeting thing, but in war, lots of things happen that are not targeted to happen. There's the unfortunate consequences, the innocent casualties where people really were not trying to hurt, and it's almost hard to imagine anything that could be worse than something affecting leading to a runaway reactor.
How does education of women relate to the crisis in Ukraine? Can you draw any parallels there?
Well, I just think that education of half of human species is involved with just about anything you can think of. It's hard to know in our present, if you will, woke society, whether it's appropriate or inappropriate to point out that women have children and have a nurturing role that may be biologically relevant. I'll talk to Dr. Doorbach on that, in terms of being against killing, which is an inherent part of war. By the same token, one can see in the news, at least, how women in the Ukraine are strongly supporting the defense of the Ukraine and are doing a job for it. So in a way, I'm ducking your question.
Why is China not in favor of imposing sanctions against Russia?
China's been opposed to imposing sanctions of any kind against any country for many years because of it basically has a foreign policy on which they focus on the national rights to be left alone to do their thing within their own country. And that partly becomes, gee, what are you doing in Tibet? What are you doing in the Uyghur folks? It partly is related to, well, we can do what we want in Taiwan because really it's part of China. And we all know that. And as we saw what they just said in Hong Kong. So it's consistent with their foreign policy. That's been the stock answer that people have given, and I think it's probably right, but I really don't know.
What does EU's granting candidate status to Ukraine mean for NATO and defense of Ukraine?
I'm sorry, what does the EU?
Granting candidate status.
Oh, Lord, it's, on the one hand, one hopes that people in Russia who are concerned about NATO coming to the Ukraine will basically say, well, I guess Putin's approach has failed because, look, what he's done has made Ukraine more likely to get closely associated with the West. But whether that's going to happen, I have no idea. But you know, that's a rational thought right now. I would hope among Russian people is this is getting us nowhere, even if we feel that Ukraine should be part of Russia or whatnot. If anything, it's making it worse for us. He's done the wrong thing. Don't know whether that any such public perception could make a difference to Mr. Putin. No.
This next question is related to your presentation in general. So to sum up, how will this war affect climate change overall, and how do wars contribute to climate change in general?
Well, that's a really good question, and that requires much more in-depth analysis than I gave. I mean, I gave the sort of, if you will, relatively trivial thing of you know, you turn carbon containing trees into things that are cut down for being able to control military actions. And I'm sure the energy use of rockets and other things is enormous. It's got to be, I mean, you don't have to drive a Prius to have better mileage from even a Humvee than you get from a tank, I'm sure. So you have all of these things set in motion that are going to be negative. How negative are they? I'm sure there's analysis being done, or had been done by Defense Department, whether they be available. I don't know, but I've never seen them. But I haven't specifically looked for that kind of analysis.
In 2021, Putin acknowledged the connection between climate change and human activity, yet Russia continues to increase fossil fuel production and remains one of the world's top carbon emitters. Is there any progress that is foreseeable to come, or was that a facade to seem progressive, in your opinion?
No, I look, it's really hard to put Russians' energy approach into any other slot than it's a country which has 30 or 40% of its foreign exchange, half of its state budget that comes out of energy. And it's going to be it's an energy dependent autocracy, much like, as I say, it's not just Russia. Any country that has a lot of energy resources is going to be in favor of fossil fuel production. And so it might say that it's related to global climate change, but it would also say that I've got more important to me is to support my people, and my people need energy, need funds from energy. I'll give one example of a personal anecdote. I knew a producer who was interested in shale gas for the TV network for Al Jazeera, in fact, and I appeared on some of their things. And then she went to work for RT, the Russian-sponsored TV network, and she called me and she said, well, we'd like you to talk about some shale gas issues. And I always talk about the health issues, which is really my only real expertise. And she said, it'll be about health and whatnot for for Russian television and be interviewed from Moscow in the Pittsburgh station. And then she mentioned, and they might ask you about I think it was Romania, I'm pretty sure it was Romania, that there was a question of whether it had shale reserves and how much shale reserves it could drill. And they changed the numbers and the Russians said they were lying. And was Romania lying about this? And I said, I'm not going to cover that whatsoever. I know nothing about that. That's not my area of expertise. She said, fine. But I know enough about Russia that what I did was to look up Russian statements about shale gas, and one of which was President Putin, I think it's about 5 years ago, President Putin had promised that by January 1st that had already passed, that they would stop flaring the methane that comes out there, which of course contributes greatly to carbon dioxide emissions from Russia. And I looked it up and they hadn't stopped flaring it yet. So sure enough, that was the very first question they asked me. What I thought about when I got on connected with Moscow. What did I think of Romania's thing? And I had my answer prepared, which if I didn't, I never would have thought of it, which was, well, it was, this is a very technologically advanced approach, this unconventional gas drilling. You're guessing at your reserves that are a mile or two underground using all sorts of indirect methods. And then how much is going to come up depending upon the geology of the area. And there's been lots of misestimates made. And it seems to me that it's like, President Putin last year saying that they were going to stop flaring and you're still continuing to flare in Russia. I'm sure it wasn't that he was lying. I'm sure it was just that it was technically inappropriate. The response was, thank you very much, and they hung up. Okay, this is where I think Russia's coming from. I can't trust any numbers coming out of Russia or any of those statements about their shale gas. And I think, by the way, that they've intentionally contributed to the anti-shale gas folks in Europe and in the US. Not that these folks know that they've been pushed by Putin. And let me say that I was against shale gas because of the way industry was doing it, not because of what it produced. And now in retrospect, I should have been maybe a little bit more, as I've stated more often, that look, this has global political issues because look what's happened.
What do you think China would do if their main ally were to lose the war? And what do you think they'll do with Taiwan?
Wow, those are really good and very important questions. And I don't know anything more than to worry about it. China's got so many different options under these circumstances. And I think more importantly, when I'm looking at China is whether it will continue how it will deal with the dual potentiality of being a country that's more capitalistic, which is more bottom up than central government. And they're going through phases where they've become from a very intense central government and do what I tell you to more recently into much more of a let individuals deal with things. And Xi is facing that issue now of, does he want to have the kind of control that allows him to say exactly who should get what, where, and how, or does he continue to allow this more capitalistic society to blossom? I'm just fascinated by seeing how it will, I think, decide on that. And how that plays out with sustainable development, I'm really not sure.
Will the war with Russia put pressure on the US to do better internationally, in your opinion?
Yes.
Maybe from like a sustainability perspective and supporting other nations during war?
Yes, I think that, again, as I tried to show where the Trump folks are coming from, the idea of not being involved in the world is pretty high. And from Alaska, I mean, it's a very Alaskan point of view of this is the last frontier. We do our thing, and I don't give a darn what's happening in the rest of the world. Alaska is a Trump state. The longer range issues for the United States are still no different than they Well, let me summarize what people in Europe very often don't understand about the United States. They're very critical of us for lots of good reasons. But when you look at war, my father was born in 1914. So, I mean, I'm spanning now the First World War, the Second World War, and Cold War, and whatnot. First World War began by the failure of European statesmen to keep the peace. And the US got sucked into it about 3 years later. The League of Nations was formed, with Woodrow Wilson, our president, suggesting it. And the US basically had a vote and said, hell no, we don't want to get involved with Europe anymore, and refused to join the League of Nations. Well, more than 20 years later, the Second World War was begun by the failure of European leaders to keep the peace, at least from American viewpoint. US got involved, got sucked into it within about 2 years. After the Second World War, the United Nations was formed, US heavily involved in it. Our point of view is, yeah, we made lots of mistakes since then, but there hasn't been a third world war yet. And so under US quasi leadership, maybe things haven't been all that bad for the world. Europe doesn't agree with that. Europe doesn't agree with the fact that I mentioned 1960. I mentioned the German reunification, the Berlin Wall falling. I think it's fair to say that a year before the Berlin Wall fell, the only world leader who believed that this could happen was Ronald Reagan. All the rest of the world leaders, and including people like myself, believe that, hey, you're going to have to live with communist Russia for the rest of eternity. Reagan believed, and it occurred. So the US leadership hasn't been completely as dumb as our friends in Europe think so.
Our last question is, why will the US and Britain not provide a no-fly zone to Ukraine?
That's a good question. I think that would be, I don't think Putin would respond in any way except widening the war. And I don't know that that helps Ukraine. That's Biden's point of view, clearly. And I think he would have trouble even now getting Europe to go along with that. Some European countries would, but I think a lot would not. But nobody pays me to make those decisions. Thanks for those wonderful questions, by the way, to all who asked them. It's a superb group of questions.
Thank you very much, Bernie, but I have one question. Do you think that a more environmentally conscious planet would lead to less war?
In the what planet?
More conscientiously, environmentally conscientious world. Would that lead to a more peaceful coexistence and basically the control of the aggressive instinct in our nature?
Yeah, I think it would. I think that's. I think anything that you get people to cooperate on works. If I go back to what's basic biology and the issue of, this is your brain on nationalism, there is a basic biological feeling of relative euphoria being out in nature. There is something that within us that appreciates nature, whether it be biology or culture, but working together to help nature, I think, is important. And I'll give one more Russian example from my experience in Russia in the 70s. What the Soviet government did was to not allow any associations of any kind that could be political. They didn't allow political parties. They didn't allow newspapers. You couldn't, as a Soviet citizen, write something to the newspaper to get something changed. There was simply no way of doing those things. One of the few organizational components they allowed were environmental groups. They were seen as just, they're berry pickers. They're going to go out and pick some berries in the woods. A lot of the original leadership in the former Soviet republics and the former, in Eastern Europe, original political leadership came out of the environmental movement that was permitted. Yes. And I think that's maybe answers your question the best way. People will come together broadly in that we don't want war. We do want, if you will, what I might call a liberal democracy, and we want to preserve our environment.
Thank you. That is a very, very positive point for us to end our session. Thank you very, very much for your time and your brilliant exposure of many, many issues. And we hope that we'll be able to have you over again when this situation in the world ends, so that we have a more peaceful discussion about what we can do for the future. So,
Dr. Dorbach, you're the greatest. You make things happen that are really important.
well, anyway, I do my as best as I can. Susie, thank you very much for your hosting and moderating. And with that, I would say have a wonderful, safe, and peaceful day. Bye-bye.
Bye now.